Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for being with us on the Many Hats Club Isolation Con, or if you've just joined us, great to have you here. Please do keep donating. The GoFundMe link is via the Many Hats Club Twitter. I think we're approaching about £7,000 nearly, which is absolutely awesome. So please keep contributing to that. Next up, a guy I know pretty well. So over to the one and only Harry McLaren.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everyone, for having me. Everyone that's involved in the setup. It's been very smooth. Brilliant so far, some great speakers. So I'm going to be running through a session for you today called Becoming a Defender. I'm going to be focusing very much on entering into a blue team or teams and the types of roles that you can expect within some of those teams, the kind of competencies that are relevant to them. So I think it's going to be appropriate if you're getting into the industry, you want to get into it, but also if you're looking to advance your career or think about what's next, hopefully there'll be some good content for you too. So this is a little bit about me. I'm a product lead at Adama, and I look after detection and response. So that's all of our services and products within that area. I'm an alumnus of Edinburgh and Napier University, so where I started and where my main passion for cybersecurity started. The co-founder, along with Stu, of Cyber Scotland Connect, a great Scotland-based community for cybersecurity and information security professionals, practitioners. And you can see me on Twitter at CyberHarryBoo. I've listed my previous roles just to kind of give you an understanding that I've pretty much always been in the blue team space. First of all, working in security operations centres and incident investigation, later on more security engineering, so building the tools that defenders use to defend their networks and respond to active cyber threats. I've then consulted across mostly large and very large enterprises of building and enhancing their security operations capabilities. And now I focus on product development in the same area for Adama. So what I'm going to be covering shouldn't be more than 40 minutes, give or take. Try and keep on schedule. I'm going to first cover just a couple of slides on why it's still really important, defensive cybersecurity, why blue teamers are still very relevant, still very important. Talk a little bit about what security operations centres are, what their purpose is, what component parts are within them. A little bit about the types of careers you can see in security operations centres, and then I'm going to focus on the competencies that defenders need to be successful and hopefully have a big impact on the industry. So first and foremost, two stats from, well, I think I collated them from 3 or 4 reports over 2019, and these were just 2 of many, but 2 of the largest as far as financial impact of the importance, to highlight the importance of cybersecurity professionals. So BEC, business email compromise, things like phishing emails and people being tricked fundamentally into doing things that it's like transferring money, changing payroll details. This is roughly 1.7 billion a year, but is dwarfed by its bigger brother, ransomware. Ransomware's been around for quite some time, but it's just been growing at an incredible rate. Everything from NotPetya, which wasn't true ransomware, but still kind of counts in this category, through to the weaponized and commercialized platforms now that cyber criminals use to spread ransomware throughout the world. So just with those 2 combined, you're talking about 9 billion a year of financial impact. So being on the defensive side of the world is not going away anytime soon. It's a very, very valid career and can be very rewarding when you think about the impact that these kind of numbers could have on businesses. This is also recognized by the World Economic Forum. So they yearly publish a fantastic survey on risk. Now, risk isn't the coolest thing in the world, but it is quite interesting when you think about it in relation to cybersecurity. So this is the top right-hand quadrant. This is where they believe that some of the most impactful, and if you look at the axis, it's impact and likelihood. So this is some of the most worrisome things that businesses should be worried about. And you'll notice there that cyber attacks is right up there along things like human-made environmental disasters, natural disasters, biodiversity loss, weather crisis. So this is not something that boards are forgetting about these days. It's starting to become more and more prominent. It's up there on the risk register for all major companies, and it's impacting them and making businesses go out of business. So so here we are on the likelihoods. We've got data fraud and theft and cyber attacks at 6 and 7, and in impact 6 and 8. So if you're thinking from a a board, shareholders' perspective, these things are absolutely critical and on the top of their list of things to worry about. Therefore, it's really important that there are well-trained and competent people in your profession that can help them respond to these things appropriately. So let's talk about what a SOC is. Now, I'm going to use the word SOC to mean Security Operations Center, and I'm going to essentially use it as a synonym for security operations, full stop. So not everyone has a SOC, but they'll usually have someone responsible for the types of roles and responsibilities that a SOC does have. So that might just be one person, might be outsourced, but I'm going to kind of refer to all of that right now as SOC, as that's my background. So what is a SOC? Well, fundamentally, a SOC is to prepare for, detect, and respond to cybersecurity threats. So preparation is making sure that you've established people, processes, and technology to support the two main things you do, which is to detect and respond. So that preparation is key because you don't want to be preparing while doing. So you don't want to be preparing or responding in a way when something's kicked off. You need to do that before the bang, before it's actually occurred, as best you can. Detection, it's all about proactive monitoring, so making sure that you understand when you're being attacked. If you've listened to any of the other talks today, or indeed, read anything about cybersecurity, you'll know that prevention, protection is never going to work 100% of the time. There are always going to be threat actors, whether they're internal or external, that can get through your defenses, whether they're layered, whether they're next gen and supported by ML and AI, doesn't matter. There's no such thing as 100% security in protection. So you have to have capabilities to detect and then respond to those incidents. So detection is about proactive monitoring, and then triaging and understanding, well, is this threat or this activity worse than another one that's happening at the same time? Where should I be focusing my time and my resources? Response is then how to then respond to what you've detected. So you think that a phishing email has hit the inbox of everyone in your executive committee. Okay, what do you do about it? And this is again where that preparation is critical, so that you have playbooks and procedures in place, so that for all of the expected types of incidents that you might come across, you have prescribed and thought out what exactly you should do. Who should you contact in IT to get them to shut down your Exchange server? Who should you contact to revoke some of your API keys in your AWS cloud because they're being abused by a ransomware bot? And so they're the key main pillars. It's detection and response, and wrapped around that is preparation. That is what security operations is fundamentally about, at least from my perspective. So what are the typical types of roles that you would see within a SOC? So these are ones that I've personally experienced, and how when I've built SOCs, that we've typically framed them in these tiers. So in the first tier, often described as tier 1, sometimes a mixture of tier 1 and 2. Your entry role is often a support analyst. Could be considered almost kind of like a help desk type role. They're typically doing things like password resets, or responding to the most basic of alerts or inquiries within security. The next role, also sometimes an entry role, is a security analyst. So at this point, at that tier 1, they're often triaging large volumes of alerts or potential security incidents, and they're trying to just work out at that first tier, is this a true positive? Is this something I'm worried about? And if it is something I'm worried about, how worried should I be? So that is then likely to then be sent to a second tier or escalated to some form of incident management function, depending upon their analysis. That's often then augmented with a senior analyst or senior security analyst, and they'll often, you might have, say, a 2 or 3 to 1 mapping there. So you might have a senior analyst sit above or with a team of other security analysts, just to provide that additional experience and guidance on the more complicated tickets or issues or alerts. In that second to third tier, this is where you're often starting to see people specialize more. So you might have a person that's specifically responsible for supporting incidents, or to be an incident investigator. So they don't react to normal tickets coming through the system, but they get pulled in for specific incident triage. So when there is a security incident, how bad is it? What's the impact? How do we contain it and recover from that security incident? You've then got threat hunters. These are people that proactively don't wait for an alert saying they've been attacked, but they go and hunt throughout the environment, throughout the logs and the metrics that are being collected, to try and actually uncover evidence of an attack, or evidence of an attacker trying to collate information. about your organization. And then they try and feed into a loop of development, which is then to proactively create detective and responsive controls so that these new techniques and tactics can be identified early, and hopefully you can then mitigate those threats. You've then got this role called a SOC specialist. These aren't in every SOC, but in the SOCs that I've worked in, this is often somebody who's a true SME, in particular one or a few areas. So we might have a big data specialist. So for us, that would be Splunk. Or you might have a specialist specifically in vulnerability management. And if that responsibility sits within the SOC, that person will often have been an analyst or incident investigator, but has then become a true SME in that technology and is then responsible for it within the SOC. So it's often an interesting role, an interesting place to kind of evolve into if you've had a very particular interest. So it might be in a suite of technologies, like it might be you've become a bit of a Cisco specialist because you've become an expert in their firewalls and their IDS, IPS, their CASB and other tooling. And then at the management tier, this is where you start to see roles like shift leader. They're often not particularly technical, but are there more of a supervisory role. SOCs often run in a 24/7 configuration, so they're there to feed and water the people side, make sure that people arrive on time, that they're doing their responsibilities correctly, that they have the right workload. And then you've got more specialisms like incident management. So this is typically a person who's responsible when an incident does get kicked off in ensuring that all of the right steps are taken to mitigate that incident and respond to it in a pre-programmed and procedural driven way. And then finally, often you have a SOC manager or service manager, and they sit above all of these roles and they face off to the business. So they will own things like service level agreements or OKRs, which are objectives and key results. They might hold the targets. They'll be responsible for, perhaps promotions, training budgets, making sure everything fits together correctly, that you have the right number of security analysts to threat hunters, that new technology coming into the SOC isn't going to overwhelm, your tier ones or tier twos. And they'll also be usually responsible for pushing through programs of change to drive efficiencies within the SOC or to, enhance their capabilities, perhaps. And so I'm not going to cover the responsibilities of all those roles because of the time constraints, but I'm going to focus on that tier 1 and 2. So these are some of the most common responsibilities you find in that tier 1 and 2 level. So this is typically for your analyst or senior analyst roles, but not necessarily exclusively. So as I mentioned, so that fundamental security monitoring and event triage, that is, being reactive to an event of interest comes into the SOC. This account has failed to log in 3 times. Is that a bad thing? And they're there to go, well, actually, that's a service account. It does that on the 30th of every month because of a script that we can't seem to get them to update. It's fine. Don't worry about it. Or no, that's happening across all of our database servers. That's not normal. So the triage step then is going to be that escalation, and that's the next responsibility. So incident escalation and incident support is to make sure that the incident management team and the specialists then jump on the right things. So at that top level tier, that those specialists have very, they're often quite rare within the business. They're expensive as far as salary, so you're not going to have many of them, but their skill set needs to be pointed in the right direction, and that's often the responsibility or a co-responsibility of the analysts. Supporting service transition, so as new services come into the SOC, security operations team, they need to be able to help the project, help the team move that in so it becomes part of their business as usual operation. And then continual improvement. So that covers the full people, process, technology. They should always be looking iteratively to improve upon their job role. And that goes for all of the roles within a SOC. You always want to be looking at how you can drive improvements to the processes, to the people themselves, to their training, how they're onboarded, and the technology. Is the technology tuned? Is it up to date? Is it doing its job correctly? And then finally, they often support management reporting. So pulling reports out of Jira, ServiceNow, Splunk, whatever, and actually reporting that up so that it can be combined into a pack for management. So that might be number of events per second that we process, number of tickets that we hit our 20-minute SLA on, how many incidents did we support, how many data sources are in scope, what's our coverage gap for our tooling. It really could be so many different things. It very much depends SOC to SOC. Okay, so now getting into the meat of it, we're now going to talk a bit about competencies or skills. I call them competencies, it's what we call them at Adama. And we've recently gone through a big body of change to really think about how we look at job roles and how we bring people into the business. So some of these slides are built on that kind of 6 months of work that we did, that I was also involved in and supported. And these are very much from my perspective and from some of the people within Adama's perspective. It's not an exhaustive list, nor is it a checklist. You shouldn't feel that all of these things have to be achieved for you to get an entry position or go up to the next rut. They're there to try and give guidelines and give something for people to consume when they're thinking about, well, where are my gaps? Where are my competency gaps? Now, we split them into 2 key areas. One is technical, which should be relatively straightforward to explain what that means. The second is behavioural, which I'll get to after, but behavioural competencies are what we've introduced, and it was us attempting to distill down what key behaviours, or in some respects soft skills, which isn't the best word for them, which is why we chose behavioural, that we look for in people that we hire. And as you know, 90% of people that work with us are defenders. It's very relevant, obviously, to the roles and responsibilities I just mentioned. So some of the technical competencies, I don't think you're going to find anything here that you don't necessarily already know, but you know, they're here for you to review and maybe consider, if you don't have some of these, if you might want to look into getting them, depending on your type of career choices or specialisms. We've got the fundamentals, which are networking. If you're sitting in a security operations center and you start to see alerts coming from networking equipment, whether that's a WAF, whether that is your routing and switching infrastructure, or you know, your firewalls, your proxies, your VPNs, and you start to see subnetting information but don't know what subnet is, or you don't know how to go and use a subnet calculator, because you know, if you're not networking admin, you may not be able to do that in your head. You know, there's going to be challenges in how successful you're likely to be in triaging those types of incidents. You have to have that underlying knowledge of the basics of the TCP/IP networking stack, for example, to understand the handoffs between each layer, up to, from the application down to the actual physical network. You don't need to be an expert, but you do have to have a handle on it. And the same goes for endpoint. You know, I'm a predominantly Windows and Mac OS user. I have implemented and managed Linux lots within the server space, never used it as a desktop system. I've played around with a lot of virtualized and physical systems and dabbled in containerization. But that breadth of experience really helps me when, if I get an alert saying that there's a, I don't know, let's say a Kerberos vulnerability on an endpoint, and I actually go and look up that vulnerability and it says it only applies to Windows servers, but the endpoint's the Linux box, that instantly helps me triage and go, that is likely to be a false positive. It's unlikely that that Linux box has a Windows vulnerability in its implementation of Kerberos. So that's why it's important to have understanding of endpoints. And that extends to mobile as well, although typically you're going to get a lot less alerting from your mobile infrastructure, especially with BYOD type things. But that's not the case all the time. Containerization, a key area to start to explore when it comes to endpoints and servers, because things are starting to get more ethereal and just running within a certain space within like a Kubernetes cluster or similar, and they have different requirements and different attributes than your more traditional virtualized or physical infrastructure that are worth paying attention to. Malware is never going away anytime soon. It's existed for decades and will continue to. It's good to understand the different types. So, you know, is it a worm? Is it a polymorphic virus? Does it spread simply via a dropper, via a phishing email, and then download and live off the land in memory and not actually download any malicious binaries itself? What are the types of patterns that we're seeing in malware at the moment? You know, are we seeing big rootkit, 0-day type approaches, or are we actually just seeing exploitations of PowerShell being poorly implemented and managed via GPO? What are the types of tools are out there that we can research? Things like VirusTotal are a great place to start, although there's an absolute incredible amount of resources in the virus and research space. Honeypots, fireless malware, as I mentioned, like living off the land. All of these things are important to, again, not be an expert in, but have an understanding of, so that as you start to triage the events and incidents that come into your system, that you can correctly infer behaviors, infer impact. You know, if you have an alert for something that's wormable within your environment, and you also happen to know that you have vulnerabilities or you're not patched much in your Windows estate, and you get an alert for a worm, that's very different to getting an alert for a browser add-in on one computer that's just a bit of, potentially unwanted program. So that kind of thing's important. Tactics and techniques. This is certainly not a new area of research, but it is being increasingly uplifted by the kind of work from MITRE with the attack framework, the common controls from the CIS, and a lot of this is building on some of the work by Lockheed Martin and the original cyber attack kill chain that they published. All of this is really important for starting to understand and be in the mindset of the attacker or attackers, considering that the phases they go through when they do reconnaissance, when they look to build and weaponize things to attack you, when they actually execute attacks and compromise and then move laterally. And then understanding at the next level down, well, what are the actual common techniques used? So if an attacker has actually managed to get a foothold within your environment, perhaps in your perimeter, how are they likely to try and move to get better privileges? How are they likely to then try and elevate those privileges and take action and try and get hold of your intellectual property or your some of your key databases with user information? When you understand those techniques, you can then start to understand that when you uncover an attack in progress, or you're tracking something that's post-attack, you can start to follow it because you understand how the attacker is likely to work. And the research in this area is fascinating because it's built upon a very broad community of people within industry that are actually telling them, well, this is actually how we got compromised. And what we found after doing 6 months of research and pulling apart our logs and our PCAPs is that they did this and they used this particular attack. That's fascinating. Well, now we're going to include it in our attack model so that everyone who uses it can go, if you want to make sure that doesn't happen to you, you need to do these configuration changes. You need to harden your controls in this area. You also need these detective and responsive controls in your SOC to know that if it happens, et cetera, et cetera. So an understanding of tactics and techniques is a really beneficial thing to know as a defender. It really gets you in the mindset all the way down to the tooling level of how an attacker might actually compromise and attack your network. And then finally, and we'll in pretty much any technical discipline serve you in good stead, that is some light programming and database experience. I'm not meaning full on, computer science, I'm a developer type thing. You do not have to be a developer to be a good defender and work in cybersecurity, but some light knowledge of something like, a scripting language like Python or Go, again, basic understanding of the programming lifecycle, especially a secure programming lifecycle, and then the types of tooling often used in, say, continuous integration, continuous delivery tooling, so version control, configuration management. Having some light experience in all these areas will only stand you in good stead, either for building your own tools or scripting your own tools for automation, for efficiency, or for trying to uncover weaknesses in other people's code or application security practices. And database understanding, so SQL, NoSQL, and big data tooling. Again, if you can manipulate information, especially at scale using big data, you will be able to be a much more successful analyst because you're able to analyze big data sets at speed rather than trying to pull it into Excel or wrap some kind of wrangling using grep. If you actually understand how to load that into a database or load it into an indexed MapReduce system that you can then query at scale, you're likely to be establishing practices that stand you in much better stead than constantly having to hack a solution together using Excel or similar. So there's a very broad range of technical competencies that I believe are really important for defenders. As I said, depending on where you want to focus, they may not all be relevant. I consider that this a foundational set, if you will, for a good defender, especially working in a SOC or SOC type environment, and think that they really do help you be successful in that area. So the second side, behavioral competencies. There's quite a lot on this slide. It's not the most attractive, but we identified 8 behavioral areas that we wanted to look for in our employees and look for in our defenders. And depending on the role, we look for light to an increasing level of knowledge or skill in these areas. So for an analyst, we don't expect them to have a huge amount of business insight at that level in their career, but we do expect them to be an engaging communicator because they're often dealing with customers, people within the business. But for a manager, we do expect them to be, an innovative thinker and a collaborative partner to a higher level than, again, we would someone starting early in their career. So these try to articulate some of the key behaviors that we look for and try to nurture as well, because that's one of the things that's important to point out, especially as somebody that I do a lot of hiring and a lot of interviewing. We don't expect people, and no one should expect somebody to come a fully formed product, a fully formed version of themselves. No one is. We're all on our own journey. We're all learning by doing, and we're often learning in response to an environment that is incredibly hostile. We are defenders because we are being attacked, and it's often easy to forget that we are constantly trying to push against a load of people with almost infinite resources that want to undo our work. They want us to not be successful. They want us to fail every day. Every attack they make, they want us to fail at our job. And so we're constantly pushing back against that. And some of these behaviors, I think, really help instill things like learning mindset, personal responsibility, performance driven. These things help push us, when we exhibit these behaviors, to push back against those attackers and often succeed in fending off their attacks or responding to them. And I think that's really important. So just get my 15-minute warning. So I will make sure to keep the pace going. So I'm not going to talk through each behavioral competency. I think they're relatively self-explanatory, and all these slides will be shared. But I'm now going to cover one final area, which I didn't mention, but it kind of feeds into this overall picture of the behaviors and things, and that is emotional intelligence. Now, emotional intelligence is kind of a buzzword. It can often be misused, and it certainly shouldn't be used as a tracking tool, to give people scores in each area and, fire people or discipline them if they're not exhibiting them. But I do think it's a really useful kind of 5-point system to consider when thinking about yourself. So one of the key things that all of this is hinged upon is self-awareness. So the ability to actually look at yourself, your behaviors, your drivers, your moods, your motivators, and assess yourself, not against others, but against, was that right? Did I maybe respond to my colleague, to my manager, to my customer because I was actually in a bad mood? Or was I right? And was my motivator actually know what they were suggesting was dangerous, and it was important for me to call them out on it? Self-awareness is a really key and foundational component of all emotional intelligence, because without it, the rest kind of doesn't work. Self-regulation, so that when you actually have some awareness and you go, I'm really frustrated or angry or sad, and you're feeling pushed to do or act in a way that perhaps is quite damaging to somebody else or yourself, are you able to maybe then pull it back and go, oh, maybe I shouldn't go and shout at that person and for being an idiot when actually I made that mistake myself 6 months ago. Maybe I should just go for a walk and then afterwards ask them if they need some help on understanding what happened. What is your motivation, and are you able to actually bring motivation to the party when you're having a bad day? So that is not just trying to be perfect. It's a frivolous exercise to try and do that, but actually using that self-awareness to go, I actually think I could cope with that situation better. How can I do that? Self-improvement, I think, is a really positive thing when it's not done obsessively and when it's not done to the detriment of others. Emotional intelligence and all these things, it's not about you going, I'm better at that than that person. It's going, well, a month ago, I dealt with that situation very poorly because I wasn't taking care of myself very well, and I kept, undersleeping, and I was knackered. But I've made some improvements in the last month, and I responded to that situation much better. That's great. That's a really good thing, and you should reward yourself for doing that. The next one is empathy, and empathy is a massively overlooked thing. Empathy is fundamentally the ability to put yourself in someone else's position and an emotional state and consider, is that why they responded in that way? Is that why they said that to me? Were they actually really upset, and they were being poorly articulate? They weren't self-regulating, and they weren't being self-aware. And then doing it to yourself as well sometimes, and being a bit kinder to yourself. It's really easy to, be really hard on yourself and go, you did that wrong, even with self-awareness, and kind of going, you should improve at that, you're crap at that. But empathy can extend to yourself and just being like, you know what? I think I did okay, actually. because I'm working really hard and I had a really tough time and self-isolation sucks, I'm going to give myself a bit of an easy time. It's okay that I didn't complete that LinkedIn learning course or learn a new language. I'm just going to empathize and go, nah, it's a bit sad being indoors all the time. It sucks. So I'm just going to chill out. And then finally, social skills. And obviously some people have natural predispositions to have social skills. Some people have learning disabilities or physical disabilities that make being social very difficult for them. And these things should be acknowledged and awareness driven for them. But for people that don't have, I guess, a natural or biological reason, it's the ability of kind of going, did I respond negatively to that? Was that actually just a joke? You know, this kind of maintaining this line between things that are reasonable and okay socially to be offended about because they were offensive, and things that are perhaps something that maybe I should just let go because it's actually okay and it was meant with no malice and it was actually just about building friendship and relationships. So I think that's a really cool and important thing as well. But anyway, they're the kind of 5 components of emotional intelligence, or they are by one or a collection of researchers. There's different interpretations of it. But we're getting close to the end now, and I do want to leave time for questions if there are any. So I'm going to now just move on to the resources section. These hyperlinks obviously don't work on your screen, but the slides will be uploaded to SlideShare and shared in whatever way the Isolation Con want to distribute them. These are just a few of the resources I often share. Some are relevant to this talk, some are relevant to other things I'm really interested in. And there's tons of research and resources out there about, skills and competencies, about, certs versus courses versus experience. And fundamentally, all of those things feed into being successful in your career and being a good defender. All of them have their place. I don't believe any are rubbish. I don't believe any are the only way forward, but I do think that all of them should be weighted, and if they help you get to where you're going, that they should be pursued, structured in a structured plan and in a way where you kind of seek help and get it from the community at large. So then finally, that's the end of my talk. As I said, Harry McLaren, I work at Adama. Please do reach out if you've got any questions or if you want to talk about, well, anything really. Quite approachable. Cyber Scotland Connect, one of the things that I do along with Stu and a number of other of our moderators. We've got our event coming up at the end of the month, obviously a virtual event, so do check that out. It should be a good one. I believe we've got a few awesome speakers. And yeah, that's it really. So if there are any questions, I'll answer them, although I realise I probably need to join the Twitch stream to see them.
Awesome, thanks, Harry. Mikey, did we have anything on Twitch? We've got obviously 6-7 minutes.
Let's have a quick look. Just give me a tick while I switch between my 17 different screens. Let's have a quick look up there. Not a great deal. I mean, Harry, your testimonies are brilliant. I really love listening to you speak, and your experience is brilliant. What about have you got any thoughts around the idea of the security analysis role in general and how people can get through it? Because I hear stories, we've spoken about this loads and loads of times over the last couple of years, around it's a tough job, right? It can be a tough job. You are frontline triage. Any tips on how people can survive that kind of role?
Yeah, I think I'd answer that in 2 ways. One is at the individual level. So I was a senior security analyst and, did shift work and did all those things. And I would definitely say, the basics of self-care. Shift work sucks for everyone who does it, especially if you're dealing in high stress situations, which security operations often is. So, make sure that when you're on your downtime that you actually do feed and water, your own emotional self. Go for walks, meditate if that's your thing, game if that's your thing, but look after yourself. During your shifts, take your breaks. I never did this and I suffered for it, but go for your breaks, go for your walks, do your best to limit caffeine where possible. I say this as a person who finished their full-time degree while working full-time shift work. It was a bad call and I regretted it deeply, as it took me 4 months to recover from doing it.
Yeah.
But when you find yourself importing caffeinated chewing gum to stay awake, you need to make some changes to the way you're managing your life.
Fair enough.
I'd say there.
Quickly, sorry, Harry. Great answer. Thank you for that. Thank you very much to Crypto Cypher for collating a couple of other questions from the room, which I missed. Are there any intro certs that you'd recommend for defenders?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's lots out there, and I definitely wouldn't just kind of go, there's definitely one and that's all we would look for. I think Security Plus from CompTIA is reasonable. I don't think it's too high level to be useless. I don't think it's too hard not to be considered around the entry level. As long as you've got a background with some of the fundamentals of networking and some of the other things I mentioned, a Security Plus, a really good step forward. There's some industry certs in specific technologies that can be useful if you're trying to join or joining a SOC that specifically works with Splunk or with other products. So there are a lot of foundational learnings and certs specifically for those vendors, but I would only do that if you know it's going to be beneficial for your role. But yeah, Security Plus would be the one for me personally, if you've already got some networking foundations. If not, then Networking Plus is probably where you want to start. Okay,
fair enough. Great answer. Sec Plus seems to be really popular. We used to hear things about CISP being bandied around, and then, oh, you must have CISP, or you must have OSCP, and you must have this, that, and the other. Yeah. But actually, Sec Plus seems to be a really well-balanced cert.
And I think, CISP is definitely not an entry-level cert. I mean, you've got to have 5 years on-the-job experience just to be considered for it, or 4 years if you've done a degree. So it's definitely entry-level. OSCP is entry level, but for pen testing and red teaming, I would say more. It's very beneficial as a defender to know how they're going to attack you, but for me, it's more important that you can do your job as a defender well than necessarily actively go out and orchestrate pen tests or red teaming type activity.
Yeah, totally agree. Okay, Harry, I'm kind of stealing Stu's thunder because he was your wingman on this, but thank you very much indeed for your time. Always appreciated, mate. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Harry. And we'll see everyone for the next talk in a few minutes. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Stu. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Appreciate it.